Should I plan my running training by distance or duration? Well, it depends, but today I'm going to talk about when and why you might want to consider using duration rather than distance as your method of prescribing and progressing your running training. Now, before we get into it, just to explain what I'm talking about here. Prescribing and planning your training by distance would be like kilometers or miles. So you might have like a 20-kilometer run, you might have a 10-kilometer run, you might have a 10-mile run, and so on and so forth. By duration would be minutes and hours. So you might have a 30-minute run, a 60-minute run, a 3-hour run, that kind of thing. Now, most runners that I encounter and myself and most running coaches will use distance. So they'll say do, this 10-mile run at this kind of pace or heart rate, and so on and so forth. We at Fix My Running use duration as our default, and there's a number of reasons why we do that, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about why that is. Now, I used to use distance as my planning method, and that's because the training plans that I downloaded off the internet to run my first marathon prescribed distances, usually in kilometers, because that's kind of what I worked in. And I would follow them to the letter, and I got injured every year for 5 years. It took me to run my first marathon. It was very frustrating and led me to go down a very confusing journey towards understanding running injuries. And eventually, after reading a lot of research papers and learning a lot, I was able to put it together in a way where I could design and progress my own training to get through some marathons without getting injured. And I then systematized that to make the Fix My Running program, which is what we do now at Fix My Running, is we help runners who are, coming back from injury or who are currently injured or who are just like perennially injured. They get injured every year and get them back to full training past this injury. Now, one of the changes I made to the way I was approaching my training, among many others, was that I switched from using the distance, so do this 10-kilometer run, do this 21-kilometer run, and so on and so forth, to duration. This is a 30-minute run, this is a 60-minute run, this is a 2-hour run, this is a 3-hour run, and so on and so forth. Now, in my opinion, when you are dealing more with injuries and injury recovery, it is better to use duration. When you are dealing with performance and trying to run faster, but you are not so concerned with injury is not a recent problem or hasn't been a continual problem, then it's probably better to use distance, or it's at least more appropriate. I would say that when you are talking about and dealing with the rehabilitation and recovery from injuries, it's much better to use duration, which is why, because most of the runners who come to us are injured or recently injured or always getting injured, and their concerns are injury, their constraint on their performance is injury. That's why we tend to use duration as our default. Now, why? Why do we do that? And that's because it's easier to quantify and progress the dose of mechanical stress being placed on the injured area. So what do I mean by that? If you imagine a female runner with knee pain, their knee, let's say it's patellofemoral pain. It's a common running injury. It's pain on the back of the kneecap, sometimes called runner's knee. And they are experiencing pain with running in that knee. And that knee, when you're running, each time you hit the ground is experiencing forces of around 3 times the body weight. So if you take sort of a typical female runner who's taking like 5,000 steps an hour, that's going to be about 360 pounds-ish of force, per step. And then you multiply 360 pounds of force per step by 5,000 steps per hour. You get 1.8 million pounds of force, right? I know this isn't precise if you're a physicist listening to this, but what I'm trying to do is convey that it is a huge amount of stress, and it is a huge amount of force that's being absorbed by the knee and has to be tolerated by the knee in order to run just for 1 hour. Now, that would be the dose of mechanical stress for that runner for 1 hour of running. And prescribing the dose of stress that is going to go on that knee, and then determining whether that is above, within, or below their adaptive capacity, and then whether they are in the adaptive zone or not, that is the most important thing, which will determine whether they will experience a lot of pain from that run or not. And it is the most important thing when it comes to recovering from that injury in terms of getting back to full training is how well that runner is able to stay within the adaptive zone, which is to say, how well the dose of mechanical stress falls within the acceptable limits for that runner. So if there is too much stress put on that knee in a given week, they will get red light pain. They'll get more pain, more sensitivity. They might even damage their knee, right? If the stress is too low, if they rest for a week, then there is no stimulus to adapt, then the knee will become weaker. If you put the right amount of stress on through running, because running is the rehab, then the knee will become less sensitive and more resilient. And the prescription and the progression of that dose of mechanical stress is the most important thing that will determine whether that runner makes a speedy and full recovery from that injury or stays stuck in the injury cycle for years on end. And that's why we use duration, because it's easier to quantify that dose of stress than it would be if we were to use distance. So for example, most runners when they are early in their recovery journey with knee pain, say they can't run for 20 minutes, they run 10 minutes and their knee hurts like hell, right? They get red light pain, right? Like, it's not appropriate to prescribe a 10-minute run to that person. So you're going to use run walking, right? So we do that. Lots of return to run programs will be like run 1 minute, walk 1 minute, repeat 10 times. Run 3 minutes, walk 1 minute, repeat X amount of times. And then you prescribe the dose of running and then the gap between that dose for that given workout. And then you rest. You give it a day, you give it 2 days, and then you allow the body to adapt to that dose, to respond to that by becoming less sensitive and more resilient. And then you hit it again. This is how you progress the person. Now, obviously, it's going to be easier to prescribe early on, run for 3 minutes, walk for 1 minute, and repeat times 10, than it is to say, run 300 meters and walk 100 meters and so on and so forth. It's just an easier prescription, practically speaking. But also for continuous running, like let's say we get past that run walk phase by progressing week on week, and this runner can now handle running 30 minutes continuously with only green light pain. And we maybe have them doing that 4 times a week. So that's 2 hours of running for that runner in total at a zone 2 pace, right? So we give them a pace or a heart rate and intensity to hold. And then we know the dose is like 2 hours of running that week. And then the next week we might make it 215 or 230, right? So it makes it very easy to quantify and progress. And then we can monitor the response. So they'll give us scores, green, orange, or red. We can use that information to say, okay, the dose was appropriate, it was too high, it was too low, and make adjustments to make sure that we always stay within the adaptive zone. It's a very simple process. We keep doing that. We keep rinsing and repeating until they can run as much as they want, until they're back to full training. Like I said, it's simple. It's not easy. I talk about it on this show all the time. That is getting in the adaptive zone. That's how you do it. That's how you build resilience in the knee so it can tolerate the stresses, the mechanical stresses that it needs to be able to tolerate when running. Now, if we were to look at the runners we work with, right, and this is something that comes up all the time in physio clinics when they don't give precise enough prescriptions, or they give prescriptions by distance, or you see like training programs prescribed by distance, is if we look at some of our faster runners, our fitter runners, right, because all runners of all levels get injured, right? So if we look at our roster of athletes, we have some very fast runners, some very slow runners, and some runners in the middle, right? The majority being in the middle. But if you take some of our faster runners and we were getting them to run, let's say they were near the end of their recovery journey, we're more moving into performance, trying to get them ready for a race. And we want them to run about, let's say we prescribed 50 kilometers per week, right, of running distributed across like 5 different runs. And we said, okay, you're going to do 50K this week, next week 55, next week 66, and so on and so forth. Some of our faster runners, even running at their easy pace, would cover that distance in like 3.5, 4 hours, right? Some of our slow runners might take 6 hours to cover the same distance, to do, 50K or just over. It might take 6 or more hours to do that. Almost double the dose of mechanical stress that the faster runner got. Now, I know that the faster runner will experience a bit more force first per step because they are running faster, but it's not going to equate to the amount of time on feet that the slower runner is going to experience. So it's very important when you have runners of different abilities to make sure that you have a system for prescribing the dose and increasing and progressing the dose that is relative to that runner, so that you don't overprescribe the mechanical dose because you're used to working with faster runners and now you have a slower one. So if you're doing a training program and you're kind of like a slower runner, and you might have, 40K per week scheduled, that might literally be taking you twice as long, right? Twice as many steps, twice as many impacts, much more mechanical force than someone who is a faster, fitter runner than you, even though physiologically you're both experiencing like that same zone 2 intensity. You're just doing it for much longer, so the amount of steps you take is much, much higher. So that's why it's so important to make sure that your training program is tailored to you and not prescribed generically for hitting a certain time in a marathon when you don't know if that's exactly where you're at. Right now, where this becomes a little bit less useful, right? So when you're dealing with what we call the recovery phase, which is where the primary constraint on a runner is their injury or their disposition to injury, where they're getting injured a lot. When injury and pain is the primary constraint, it's better to use duration. It's better to plan your training runs and your training week and your training progressions by minutes and hours, not distance. Now, I would say you can do that all the way through to performance, which is where, your primary constraint is not injury. You're not worried about getting injured. You don't keep getting injured. That's not the reason you're not running as fast or as far as you want to. The reason is more fitness, right? You're trying to build your fitness. You're not so worried about injury. There's always a concern. There's always both things going on, but it's not the primary constraint. So when it's more performance that you're focused on, in which case you're probably not listening to this show, then distance is a more appropriate prescription tool. Not that you can't use duration, and we do, but I still do for me personally, but it's a bit more appropriate to use distance, and that's because the races are usually in distance, right? A marathon is going to be 42.2 kilometers. It's not going to be X amount of hours, right? There are some duration-based races, but they are in a large amount. That's not the right wording. They are the minority, right? There's far many I can't talk. There's far more races that are prescribed or a set distance than a set duration. So when you're training to do like a PR, or you're trying to do a new race distance, maybe you're going for your first marathon, or you're going for your first 100-mile race, like it's generally going to be more precise to train using distance, because then you know how long it's going to take you to do that event, and you can anticipate how you need to train in order to improve that time. So I think of it like a spectrum, with the more injury and pain being the concern, the more you're in that recovery phase, it's better to use duration. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the more you're not worried about injury and you're really focused on optimizing performance, it's a bit better to use distance as your prescription tool. But you can use both, right? Like you can rehabilitate someone with an injury by telling them to run X amount of miles or kilometers per run and per week. It's just practically, it's a little bit more difficult, right? And you can train optimal performance using duration. And in fact, with most of our runners, we end up using duration long term because one, they get used to it and they just kind of like it. Plus, like, for me, this morning I had a 45-minute run. Like, it's nice to know exactly how long my run's going to take. It's easier to plan the morning around the kids and work and that kind of stuff. So that element of it is nice too, even when you get past the injury concerns. And a lot of our runners, when we do that, when we transition them from recovery, from injured into performance, and then we go do that next race and the one after and the one after, they'll often start logging PRs, not because we're being super precise with their race times, but more just as a default because they're not getting injured anymore. The reason they weren't getting PRs and improving was because they kept getting injured every 6 months or 12 months. And when we stopped that from happening by doing a bunch of stuff, optimizing the 3 critical components, using duration as their prescription tool as one of the methods, they stop getting injured so much, and the injuries they do get are minor, they're more like niggles, and they can have consistent training, their body can adapt to that, and they just get faster just by default. But if you look at like optimal performance, particularly when you're trying to finish a race in a certain time, then it's probably better to have at least some of your workouts by distance. So you might have, let's say, a track session where you're doing intervals of set numbers of meters, or you might have your long runs where, if you're doing a marathon, it's nice to hit that 20 miles, right? You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be able to do 26 because I did 20, rather than doing like just a 3.5 hour run where if you're a slower runner, you might not cover that full distance in that time. Now, this is all to say, even when you're dealing with performance, if you're prescribing by duration, as we do, we're always going to track distance. We're always going to look at it. But we're going to be most concerned with how long the person was running rather than how fast they ran. How fast they ran is do they call it a lagging indicator, or something we look at retrospectively rather than prescription, which we base on duration. So to sum up, the more pain and injury is a problem, the more you're in the recovery phase, it's better to use duration. The more performance and fitness is the primary concern, it's probably better to use distance. Now, what we're talking about here is running is the rehab, right? So as I talk about all the time, running is the rehab. You have to dose and progress the amount of mechanical stress placed on the injured area, whatever the injury is, if you want to resolve a running injury. It is the most important of the three critical components. So remember, we have the three critical components. They're in a pyramid. The top is form or technique, right? The middle is strength. And the bottom is resilience. The bottom of the pyramid, the most important thing, the thing that you should spend most of your time on if you're an injured runner, is determining the correct dose and the rate of progression of that dose of the mechanical stress placed on that area by running, which is to say running is the rehab. It does not matter if you have perfect running form, if you get the prescription of the amount of running your knee can tolerate wrong. It will always hurt. So it's most important that that is prescribed and progressed precisely and then tracked in terms of what was the response to that amount of running. Was it green, orange, or red? What did the pain do? And how do we adjust the rate of progression based on that? And if this is not part of your recovery program, this is not sounding familiar to you, if you're not getting precise instructions about how to progress your running injury and you're listening to this thinking, maybe that's why I'm not getting anywhere. Maybe this is why I keep getting injured. Yes, it is. It almost definitely is. So click the link in the description, book a free call. It's always there. And we'll have a chat about it and see exactly what's going on with that resilience piece, where running becomes the rehab, right? And we'll determine if we're a good fit to help you with it, or at least give you some advice on how you might approach it.